The early morning sun cast long shadows across the federal building as Special Agent Andre Chen walked through the underground parking garage, her footsteps echoing against concrete walls. She'd been with the FBI's Public Corruption Division for just over 3 years, but this one was different. The Cedar Grove Police Department investigation had consumed her life, turning her desk into a maze of files, photographs, and witness statements. She remembered the day it all started. A nervous rookie officer had approached the FBI field office, hands shaking as he slid a manila envelope across her desk. Inside were photos of evidence bags being tampered with, dates changed, and items missing. But what caught her attention wasn't the obvious theft, it was the systematic nature of it all. Someone had created a perfect system of corruption, and they'd been running it for years. The elevator hummed as she rode up to her office on the 4th floor, coffee in one hand, case files in the other. The morning cleaning crew nodded their usual greeting. They'd gotten used to seeing her here at dawn, sometimes even before they arrived. Her dedication hadn't gone unnoticed. Her supervisor had tried multiple times to get her to take a break, but how could she? Every day she delayed meant another day Detective Robert Wilson walked free, another day he could threaten witnesses or destroy evidence. Wilson wasn't just any corrupt cop. He was Cedar Grove's golden boy, their most decorated detective. Local news channels loved him. Community groups gave him awards. Schools invited him to speak to children about integrity and justice, the irony of which made Chen's stomach turn. She'd spent months building a picture of his real activities: protection money from local businesses, evidence disappearing from drug busts, case files being lost for the right price. The office was quiet at this hour, just how she liked it. Chen spread the latest surveillance photos across her desk. They showed Wilson meeting with business owners in back alleys, having lunch with known drug dealers, exchanging packages in parking lots. All suspicious, but nothing concrete enough for an arrest. Not yet. Her computer chimed. A new email from one of her confidential informants inside the department. As she read, her heart began to race. Wilson's former partner was ready to talk. After months of hesitation, he'd finally agreed to come forward with documentation of Wilson's activities going back 5 years. This could be the break she needed. Chen leaned back in her chair, allowing herself a small smile. She thought about all the people Wilson had hurt, all the families affected by his crimes. The small business owners paying protection money they couldn't afford. The innocent people convicted because evidence in their cases mysteriously vanished. The honest cops whose careers had been destroyed when they tried to speak up. Her phone buzzed. A text from her mother asking if she'd be coming to Sunday dinner this week. Chen sighed. She'd missed the last 3 family gatherings because of this case. Her mother didn't understand why she worked such long hours, why she couldn't just be content with a normal 9-to-5 job. How could she explain that this wasn't just work to her? This was about justice, about making sure people like Wilson couldn't abuse their power anymore. The office began to fill as other agents arrived. Chen could hear the usual morning sounds: coffee brewing, computers starting up, casual conversations about weekend plans. But her mind was already racing ahead, planning her next moves. Wilson's partner would need protection, serious protection. Wilson had friends throughout local law enforcement, and whistleblowers had a way of running into trouble. She pulled up the witness protection paperwork on her computer and began filling it out. 3 years of work were coming to a head, and she couldn't afford any mistakes. Wilson was smart, connected, and dangerous, but he had one crucial weakness. Like many corrupt officers before him, he didn't believe a federal agent, especially one who looked like her, could possibly bring him down. That underestimation would be his downfall. Chen had built her case methodically, gathering evidence piece by piece, protecting her witnesses, documenting every threat and attempted intimidation. Wilson might have the local power structure in his pocket, but she had something better: the truth, backed by federal resources, and an unshakable determination to see justice done. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Chen began preparing for her meeting with Wilson's partner. This would be the first of many dominoes to fall, and she needed everything to be perfect. She checked her recorder, reviewed her questions, and sent a coded message to her backup team. Today marked the beginning of the end for Detective Wilson's corruption empire, and he didn't even know it yet. The morning news played quietly in the background, another story about Wilson receiving a community service award. Chen watched his confident smile as he accepted the plaque, knowing that soon that smile would disappear. Justice might take time, but it was coming. And when it did, it would show everyone that no one, not even Cedar Grove's most celebrated detective, was above the law. The tension in Cedar Grove Police Department was becoming unbearable. Detective Wilson sat at his desk, staring at the surveillance photos spread before him. Someone had left them in his mailbox, pictures of him meeting with his business associates, each one marked with dates and times. The message was clear. The feds were watching. But what really got under his skin wasn't the surveillance. It was the FBI agent leading the investigation. Through his connections, he'd learned it was Agent Chen from the Public Corruption Division. He'd seen her once, walking through the courthouse, young, probably in her early 30s, barely over 5'5". The thought that she could threaten everything he'd built over 20 years made him laugh. "You look worried, Rob," said Officer Thompson, leaning against his desk. "That's not like you." Wilson forced a smile, quickly sliding the photos into his drawer. "Just some paperwork giving me a headache. Nothing I can't handle." But inside, his mind was racing. He'd dealt with internal affairs investigations before, managed to shut down 2 corruption probes from the state police. This would be no different. That afternoon, he made some calls. He still had friends in high places, judges who owed him favors, prosecutors who'd built their careers on his arrests, politicians who'd accepted his campaign contributions. One call to the right person, and this investigation would disappear like all the others. But something was different this time. His usual contacts seemed nervous, hesitant. Some didn't return his calls at all. During a lunch meeting with Judge Pavison, his old golf buddy, he got his first real warning. "This isn't like before, Rob," the judge whispered, glancing around the crowded restaurant. "This FBI agent, she's been building this case for years. She's got federal resources, witness protection. I can't help you this time. Nobody can." Wilson dismissed the warning. He'd worked too hard, built too much to let some rookie federal agent take it all away. That evening, he decided to send his own message. He knew people who could make life difficult for Agent Chen, nothing illegal, just some pressure to remind her how things worked in Cedar Grove. The next morning, Chen's car had 4 flat tires in the federal building parking lot. A week later, her apartment's windows were broken in a random act of vandalism. Anonymous calls filled her voicemail, each one a reminder that she was pushing into dangerous territory. But Chen didn't back down. Instead, she documented every incident, added them to her case file, and kept pushing forward. Her calm persistence started to unnerve Wilson. He was used to people backing off when threatened, but she seemed almost grateful for the evidence he was giving her. The situation reached a breaking point when Wilson's most trusted sergeant asked for a private meeting. They met in their usual spot, the quiet bar on the edge of town where they'd discussed business for years. "They got to Jimmy," the sergeant said, his voice shaking. "Your old partner, he's talking to the feds. Full witness protection deal. He's got documents, recordings, everything." Wilson's hand tightened around his glass. Jimmy had been there from the beginning, helped set up the whole operation. He knew everything. "That's impossible," he muttered. "Jimmy would never." "It's different this time," the sergeant continued. "This Agent Chen, she's not playing by our rules. She's been 3 steps ahead this whole time, waiting for us to make mistakes, and we've been making plenty." For the first time in years, Wilson felt real fear. He built his entire empire on the assumption that he could control or intimidate anyone who threatened it. But how do you intimidate someone who turns your threats into evidence? How do you control an investigation that's been quietly building for years? That night, alone in his home office, Wilson pulled out an old photo, his police academy graduation 20 years ago. He'd been idealistic then, believed in justice and doing the right thing. Somewhere along the way, that young officer had disappeared, replaced by someone who saw his badge as a license to profit. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, "Meeting tomorrow, 9 a.m., Federal Building. Your choice how this ends." He knew it was from Chen. The fact that she'd gotten his personal number was another sign of how deeply she penetrated his network. Wilson poured himself another drink, trying to steady his nerves. He'd face her tomorrow, trying one last time to take control of the situation. But deep down, he was beginning to realize his first mistake might have been his last, underestimating a federal agent who'd spent years preparing for this moment. As midnight approached, Wilson sat in his darkened office, listening to distant sirens. He'd always thought his position, his connections, his power would protect him. Now, those same things had become evidence against him, carefully documented by an agent he'd foolishly dismissed. Tomorrow would decide everything, and for the first time in his career, Detective Wilson wasn't sure he'd come out on top. Dawn broke over Cedar Grove as Agent Chen sat in a secure safe house, reviewing testimony with Jimmy Porter, Wilson's former partner. The small room was cramped, filled with the smell of cheap coffee and the nervous energy of a man who'd finally decided to break his silence. "He's going to know it was me," Jimmy said, his hands shaking as he looked through old logbooks. Wilson always knows when someone turns on him. He'd lost weight since agreeing to cooperate, and dark circles under his eyes showed he wasn't sleeping much. Chen pushed a fresh cup of coffee across the table. "That's why we've got you and your family protected. Tell me more about the evidence locker system." She kept her voice calm, steady, a technique she'd learned early in her career. Nervous witnesses needed stability. Jimmy took a deep breath, spreading out a hand-drawn diagram of the police station's evidence room. Thursday nights were key. Wilson arranged the schedule so his people were always on duty. That's when things would disappear. Drug evidence, mostly. Sometimes cash from seizures. As Jimmy talked, two other agents typed quietly in the corner, documenting every detail. They'd been at this for 6 hours already, but Jimmy was finally opening up, sharing secrets he'd kept for years. Across town, Wilson was discovering just how quickly his world was shrinking. His usual morning briefing was interrupted by the arrival of Internal Affairs investigators armed with warrants for department records. He watched helplessly as they began copying evidence room logs, the same logs he'd carefully manipulated for years. "This is harassment," he announced to anyone who would listen. Some fed with a grudge, trying to make a name for herself. But he noticed how other officers avoided his eyes, how conversations stopped when he entered rooms. The whispers had started. By noon, 3 more officers had called in sick, all members of Wilson's inner circle. His calls went straight to voicemail. Even his most loyal supporters were going dark, trying to save themselves. The web he'd spent years building was unraveling thread by thread. In her temporary office at the federal building, Chen tracked the department's disintegration with methodical precision. Each officer who went silent represented another crack in Wilson's foundation. Her wall map of connections was covered in red marks, showing everyone who'd agreed to cooperate. "Agent Chen," her assistant poked his head in. "You need to see this." He handed her a tablet showing surveillance footage from outside the evidence room. The timestamp read 3 a.m., 4 officers loading boxes into unmarked cars. "They're panicking," Chen said, allowing herself a small smile. "Get teams ready. They'll be trying to destroy evidence." She'd anticipated this, had surveillance teams in place. Every attempt to hide their crimes just gave her more proof. That afternoon, she received an unexpected visitor. Officer Thompson, one of Wilson's closest allies, sat nervously in her office. "I want to make a deal," he said, avoiding her eyes. "I've got recordings. Conversations Wilson doesn't know about. Insurance, you know." Chen listened patiently as Thompson laid out years of corruption. Names, dates, amounts, everything she needed to solidify her case. Each new witness made the next one easier to flip. Fear was spreading through the department like wildfire. By evening, the local news was running stories about an FBI investigation into Cedar Grove PD. Chen watched from her office as reporters gathered outside the police station. Wilson appeared briefly, still projecting confidence, but she could see the strain on his face. "Your office is getting calls," her supervisor said, leaning against her doorframe. "Other departments around the state wanting to know how we built this case. You're making waves." Chen nodded, but her mind was already on the next step. Wilson was wounded but not finished. Like any cornered animal, he'd be most dangerous now. She'd seen his type before. They'd rather burn everything down than surrender. As night fell, she received an urgent message from Jimmy's protective detail. Wilson had been spotted near the safe house. Not close enough to be a threat, but enough to send a message. He was letting them know he could still reach out and touch them. Chen gathered her team for a late-night briefing. He's getting desperate, she told them. That makes him dangerous, but it also makes him sloppy. Stay alert, document everything. They'd come too far to make mistakes now. In his empty house, Wilson sat in darkness, watching news reports about his department's investigation. His phone had been silent for hours. No one wanted to risk being connected to him now. The sounds of distant sirens reminded him of how quickly things had changed. Tomorrow would bring more defections, more evidence, more cracks in his carefully built empire. But tonight, in the darkness, he still couldn't believe it was happening. How had he let that federal agent get so deep into his operation? How had she turned his most trusted people against him? The answer, he was beginning to realize, lay in his own arrogance. He'd been so certain of his power, so convinced of his invulnerability, that he'd never seen the trap closing around him. Now, watching his world crumble, Detective Wilson finally understood the price of underestimating Agent Chen. The police station parking lot was nearly empty at dusk, just as Wilson had planned. He stood beside his car, watching the sun sink behind the old courthouse building. The meeting had been his idea, one last chance to handle things the old way, face to face. His confidence had taken hits lately, but he still believed he could control this situation. Agent Chen arrived exactly on time, parking her standard-issue federal vehicle 3 spaces away. Wilson watched her approach, trying to understand how this person, someone who looked more like a college professor than a federal agent, had managed to shake his whole world apart. "Detective Wilson," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet lot. "I was surprised you wanted to meet here." She stopped a careful distance away, hands visible, calm but alert. Years of experience had taught her that moments like these could turn dangerous quickly. "I thought we should talk," Wilson replied, attempting his usual charming smile. "Clear up some misunderstandings." He gestured to a security camera overhead. "Don't worry. I had it turned off. We can speak freely." "The camera's working fine," Chen responded. "I had my team make sure of that before I arrived. Everything you say is being recorded." She saw his smile falter slightly. "Just like I recorded our last 3 conversations when you tried to approach my witnesses." The parking lot felt smaller suddenly. Wilson's carefully planned speech about mutual understanding and professional courtesy seemed hollow now. "You're making a mistake," he tried anyway. "I've got friends in places you can't imagine." "One phone call." "Judge Patterson." Chen interrupted. "He's been cooperating with us for weeks. Or maybe you mean Councilman Hayes. He gave us some very interesting recordings yesterday." She took a small notebook from her pocket. "Would you like me to list your other friends? The ones who've all decided to save themselves?" Wilson felt sweat on his neck despite the cool evening air. This wasn't going according to plan. Where was the intimidated federal agent he'd expected? The one who'd back down when confronted with real power. 20 years on the force, he said, his voice getting louder. "You think you can just walk in here and tear everything down? You don't understand how things work in Cedar Grove. We take care of our own." Chen didn't flinch at his tone. Instead, she opened a file folder she'd been carrying. "Let's talk about how things work, Detective. May 15th, you arranged for evidence to disappear in the Reynolds drug case. June 3rd, you collected protection money from 6 businesses on Oak Street. July 28th, you threatened Officer Parker when he questioned missing funds." Each date hit like a physical blow. Wilson felt his chest tightening. "Those are lies," he managed, but his voice had lost its authority. "Your partner Jimmy gave us the recordings," Chen continued. Her tone remained professional, almost gentle. "But we already had most of it. 3 years of surveillance, financial records, witness statements. We know about the offshore accounts, the property under your wife's maiden name, the meetings with drug dealers at your fishing cabin." Wilson leaned against his car, his legs feeling weak. "You can't prove any of that." "We already have." Chen closed her folder. "That's what I've been trying to tell you, Detective. This isn't a negotiation or a threat. It's just a courtesy notification." She checked her watch. "About 14 hours, we'll be executing search warrants at 16 locations. Your house, your cabin, your storage units, and every other place you've hidden evidence over the years." The last light was fading from the sky, shadows growing longer across the parking lot. Wilson felt the darkness closing in around him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you deserve to know it's over," Chen replied. "Your friends have abandoned you. Your partner gave us everything. All your threats and intimidation tactics are just more evidence now. The only question left is how you want this to end." Wilson's hand twitched toward his hip, an unconscious gesture that didn't go unnoticed. Chen didn't move, but he saw two unmarked cars quietly pull into the parking lot, positioning themselves at the exits. "You've got a choice," Chen continued. "Come in voluntarily tomorrow morning, or we'll arrest you at home in front of your family and the news cameras. Either way, this ends tomorrow." The reality of his situation finally hit Wilson. All his power, his connections, his careful planning, none of it mattered anymore. This federal agent hadn't just outmaneuvered him, she'd dismantled his entire world piece by piece while he underestimated her. "You could have ended this investigation," Wilson said quietly. "One phone call to the right person. I would have made it worth your while." Chen shook her head. "That's still the only kind of power you understand, isn't it? Bribes and threats. But there's something stronger than that, Detective. It's called justice." She turned to walk away, then paused. 9 a.m. tomorrow. Your choice how it happens." Wilson watched her drive away, the unmarked cars following quietly. The parking lot felt enormous now, empty and dark. His phone buzzed, probably his wife wondering why he was late for dinner. But he couldn't move, couldn't think what to say. For the first time in 20 years, Detective Wilson had no moves left to make, no cards left to play. In 14 hours, everything he'd built would come crashing down. And it had all started with his fatal mistake. Underestimating a determined FBI agent who believed in something bigger than power and money. The morning dawned gray and cold over Cedar Grove, a light drizzle painting the streets with reflections of red and blue lights. Agent Chen had been awake since 3 a.m., coordinating teams, double-checking warrants, making sure everything was perfect. She couldn't help but think of all the cases that had fallen apart because of one small mistake. Not this time. All teams in position, crackled her radio. Across Cedar Grove, federal agents and state police were stationed outside key locations: Wilson's house, his lakeside cabin, 3 storage units, and various other properties connected to his corruption network. Chen stood in the command center they'd set up in a vacant office building, watching dots move on a digital map. Each dot represented a team. Each team represented years of work, countless hours of surveillance and investigation. The weight of the moment pressed down on her shoulders. At his kitchen table, Wilson sat staring at his coffee, watching the steam rise in the dim morning light. His wife moved quietly around the kitchen, pretending everything was normal, though they both knew it wasn't. He'd told her some of it last night, enough to understand why there might be cameras outside their house this morning. "You should eat something," she said softly, placing toast in front of him. 25 years of marriage had taught her when to push and when to just be present. This was a being present moment. Wilson's phone buzzed, a text from one of his few remaining allies. FBI at the station, dozens of them. He didn't reply. What was there to say? The next text came moments later. "They're in the evidence room. They're everywhere." Across town, Jimmy Porter watched the raid unfold from a safe distance, protected by federal agents. His hands shook as he sipped gas station coffee, remembering all the times he helped Wilson move evidence, collect payments, threaten witnesses. Now it was all coming out. "You did the right thing," said the agent beside him. Jimmy nodded, but couldn't shake the feeling of being a traitor. Even knowing Wilson's crimes, even knowing he'd helped stop something wrong, breaking that blue wall of silence felt like crossing a line he could never uncross. Back at Wilson's house, the decision was made for him. The doorbell rang at exactly 9:01 a.m. He knew who waited on the other side. His wife touched his shoulder gently as he stood, straightening his tie one last time. Agent Chen stood on his porch, flanked by other agents. The neighbors were already gathering on their lawns, phones out, recording history in the making. "Detective Wilson," she said formally. "Do you need a moment to say goodbye to your wife?" It wasn't what he'd expected, this small kindness. He nodded, turning back to the kitchen where his wife waited. They didn't speak. No words could capture this moment. Just a long hug, a gentle kiss, and a whispered "I'm sorry" that contained 20 years of choices. Across Cedar Grove, The operation moved with precision. Storage units revealed boxes of documentation, years of detailed records Wilson had kept as insurance against his allies. The lakeside cabin's hidden safe contained hundreds of thousands in cash, along with flash drives full of incriminating photos and videos. At the police station, officers watched in stunned silence as federal agents carried box after box from the evidence room. Some looked angry, others relieved, but most just looked tired. The weight of years of corruption lifting, but leaving exhaustion in its wake. Call from the mayor's office, Chen's assistant reported. They want to know how bad it is. She looked at the growing pile of evidence, the documents revealing corruption reaching into every corner of city government. What should I tell them? Tell them to watch the news, Chen replied, signing another evidence log. This wasn't just about Wilson anymore. His careful records were going to shake Cedar Grove to its foundations. By noon, the scale of the operation became clear. 17 arrests across the city, including 3 judges, a deputy mayor, and 6 other police officers. Local news crews broadcast live as Wilson was led into the federal building, his face set in stone, still trying to maintain dignity in handcuffs. Chen watched the coverage from her office, feeling not triumph but a deep, quiet satisfaction. On her desk sat a photo she'd kept through the whole investigation, a young officer killed 10 years ago after trying to report corruption. His family had never gotten justice until today. The rain continued falling as federal agents worked into the evening, documenting evidence, tracking money trails, unraveling decades of corruption. In holding cells across the city, Wilson's former allies began competing to make deals, each trying to save themselves by revealing more secrets. At the safe house, Jimmy Porter watched his old partner's perp walk on TV. He really thought he was untouchable, he said to no one in particular. We all did. The agent beside him nodded, understanding the complex mix of relief and regret in his voice. As darkness fell, Chen finally allowed herself to sit down, really sit down, for the first time in nearly 20 hours. Her team had performed flawlessly. Wilson's empire hadn't just been damaged, it had been dismantled, documented, and destroyed beyond any hope of recovery. Her phone buzzed with a message from her mother, saw the news. You did good, daughter. Chen smiled, feeling tears she hadn't expected. 3 years of her life, countless sacrifices, moments of doubt and frustration, all worth it for this day. In his holding cell, Wilson sat alone with his thoughts, finally understanding how completely he'd been outmaneuvered. He'd spent years building a network based on fear and greed, never realizing that something stronger existed. The quiet determination of someone fighting for justice. The federal courthouse buzzed with tension on the first day of the trial. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the gray October sky like metal trees. Agent Chen walked up the stairs, her testimony files tucked under her arm, watching the crowd of reporters and curious citizens gather behind the security barriers. Inside, the hallways echoed with whispers and footsteps. 3 months had passed since the raids, but the shock still hadn't worn off. Cedar Grove was a different place now, quieter, more cautious, as if the whole city was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. You ready for this? Her supervisor asked, falling into step beside her. Chen nodded, though her stomach was doing flips. She testified in court before, but never in a case this big. Never with so much riding on every word. The courtroom was already packed when Wilson was led in. He wore an expensive suit that somehow made him look smaller than Chen remembered. Their eyes met briefly as he passed. She saw no anger there, just a tired acceptance. He'd aged years in the past 3 months. All rise, called the bailiff, and the proceedings began. The prosecutor's opening statement laid out the case methodically. 20 years of corruption, millions in stolen money, dozens of lives ruined. Chen watched the jury's faces, saw them trying to process the scope of it all. The evidence will show, the prosecutor continued, that Detective Wilson didn't just break the law. He broke the public's trust. He turned his badge into a license to steal, his authority into a weapon against the very people he swore to protect. Wilson's defense team tried to paint him as a product of a broken system, a good cop pushed into bad choices by circumstances beyond his control. But the evidence told a different story. Day after day, witnesses took the stand, each one adding another piece to the puzzle. Jimmy Porter's testimony was particularly powerful. He spoke quietly but clearly, describing how the corruption had started small, looking the other way for a few dollars here, losing some evidence there, then grew into something none of them could control. We told ourselves we weren't hurting anyone, he said, his voice carrying in the silent courtroom. But we were hurting everyone. Every time we took a bribe, every time we fixed a case, we were betraying everything that badge stands for. Chen's own testimony lasted 3 days. She walked the jury through the investigation step by step, showing how Wilson's empire had been built and how it had finally fallen. The defense tried to shake her story, but the evidence was too solid, too well documented. Agent Chen, Wilson's lawyer, asked during cross-examination, "Isn't it true that you pursued this case with unusual vigor? That perhaps your personal feelings about police corruption colored your investigation?" Chen looked straight at Wilson as she answered, "I pursued this case because it needed to be pursued, because every citizen deserves law enforcement they can trust. Detective Wilson didn't just break laws, he broke that trust, and he taught others to break it too." As weeks passed, the evidence mounted. Financial records showed millions flowing through offshore accounts. Surveillance photos captured countless illegal meetings. Recorded conversations revealed the casual way Wilson and his associates had discussed their crimes. The families of his victims filled the courtroom each day. Chen noticed one woman who never missed a session, the mother of that young officer who'd tried to report corruption and paid with his life. She sat quietly, taking notes, finally seeing justice for her son. Wilson's wife stopped coming after the first week. The strain had been too much, watching her husband's carefully constructed image crumble under the weight of evidence. Their house had been seized, their accounts frozen, 25 years of marriage ending in an empty apartment and weekly prison visits. The defense's case seemed weak in comparison. Character witnesses spoke about Wilson's community service, his charity work, his years of solving crimes. But under cross-examination, many admitted they'd had suspicions about his activities, had heard rumors but looked the other way. After 6 weeks of testimony, it was time for closing arguments. The prosecutor stood before the jury one last time, pointing to the mountain of evidence boxes stacked against the wall. "In these boxes," she said, "you'll find thousands of pages of records, hundreds of hours of recordings, dozens of witness statements. But what you won't find is a single moment of remorse." Detective Wilson didn't stop because he realized he was wrong. He stopped because Agent Chen and her team finally made him stop. The jury deliberated for just 4 hours, surprisingly quick for such a complex case. As the foreman stood to read the verdict, Chen felt her heart pounding. 3 years of her life had led to this moment. "On the count of racketeering, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of conspiracy, we find the defendant guilty." The list went on, count after count, guilty after guilty. Wilson stood stone-faced, his lawyer's hand on his arm. The judge's sentence came a week later, 25 years in federal prison, no possibility of parole. As Wilson was led away, he paused near Chen's seat. "You were right," he said quietly. "I did underestimate you. That was my biggest mistake." Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions about justice and victory. Chen thought about all the small moments that had led to this day, the late nights reviewing files, the worried witnesses, the gradual building of trust. Victory felt different than she'd expected, not triumphant, but quietly satisfying. "What happens now?" a young reporter asked her. Chen looked at the courthouse steps, where more people were gathering, citizens coming to witness the end of this chapter in their city's history. "Now," she said, "Cedar Grove gets a chance to heal, to build something better on a foundation of truth instead of corruption." As she walked to her car, Chen heard her phone buzz with a message. It was from Jimmy Porter. "Thank you for helping us do the right thing." She smiled, thinking about how many lives had been touched by this case, some destroyed, others renewed. The sun was setting over Cedar Grove, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new cases, new battles for justice. But today, watching Wilson's corrupt empire end not with a bang, but with the quiet finality of a judge's gavel, Chen felt at peace with her role in it all. 6 months after Wilson's sentencing, Cedar Grove Police Department looked different. Gone were the dark wood panels and outdated filing systems. The newly renovated building featured glass walls and modern technology, a physical symbol of the transparency the department now promised its citizens. Agent Chen walked through the familiar halls, noticing how much had changed. Officers who once avoided eye contact now greeted her with respect. The fear that had haunted these corridors was gone, replaced by a cautious optimism. "The new Oversight Committee meets today," said the interim police chief, falling into step beside her. "We'd really appreciate your input." After Wilson's conviction, the city had created a civilian oversight board to help rebuild trust between the police and community. Chen had agreed to stay on as a federal advisor during the transition. The conference room was filled with a mix of faces: community leaders, police officers, local business owners. People who would never have sat at the same table 6 months ago were now working together to rebuild their city's law enforcement from the ground up. "Let's talk about the new training programs," the chief began. Chen watched him interact with the civilian members, noting how different his approach was from Wilson's era. Where Wilson had demanded loyalty through fear, the new leadership sought cooperation through transparency. Outside, construction crews were renovating the evidence room. The old system, designed to hide corruption, was being replaced with modern tracking technology. Every piece of evidence would now have a digital trail, every access logged and monitored. Agent Chen, a young officer, caught up with her in the hallway. "We found another one of Wilson's old files." He handed her a worn folder. "Looks like a case from 15 years ago. Evidence tampering, probably an innocent person convicted." Chen nodded, adding it to her growing stack. Part of the healing process was reviewing old cases, finding and fixing past injustices. It was slow, painful work, but necessary. Every wrongful conviction overturned, every corrupted case revealed, helped restore faith in the system. In the break room, she overheard 2 veteran officers talking with new recruits. "Back then, we all knew something was wrong," one said. "But speaking up meant risking everything. Now," he gestured to the posters on the wall advertising the department's new anonymous reporting system. The afternoon brought a community meeting in the city hall. Chen sat in the back, watching citizens voice their concerns directly to police leadership. Some were angry, others hopeful, all engaged in a dialogue that would have been impossible under Wilson's reign. "My brother was wrongly convicted in 2012, one woman said, her voice shaking. The new review board looked at his case, found the tampering. He's home now, after 10 years. She wiped tears away. "That's what real police work should do, find the truth, not hide it." Later, Chen visited Jimmy Porter at his new job, teaching ethics at the police academy. He'd found his calling helping young officers understand the subtle ways corruption could take root, how small compromises could lead to major crimes. "I tell them my story," he said, showing her the classroom. "Not to shock them, but to warn them. To show them how easy it is to cross lines if you're not careful." On his desk sat a framed photo of his graduation from the academy, a reminder of why he'd become a cop in the first place. The sun was setting as Chen drove through Cedar Grove's streets. She passed local businesses that once paid protection money, now displaying community partner stickers from the new police outreach program. The fear that had gripped this city was fading, replaced by something stronger: hope. Her phone buzzed. A message from her supervisor back at the FBI. Other cities were requesting information about the Cedar Grove case, wanting to learn from its example. The investigation's impact was spreading beyond city limits, becoming a blueprint for fighting corruption nationwide. At home, Chen found a letter in her mailbox, no return address, but she recognized the handwriting. Wilson's wife had written to thank her, not for arresting her husband, but for giving Cedar Grove a chance to heal. "The truth hurt," she wrote, "but lies were destroying us all." That night, Chen sat on her balcony, looking out over the city she helped transform. A news alert popped up on her phone. The city council had just approved funding for a new police training center focused on ethics and community relations. The old guard was truly giving way to the new. She thought about Wilson sitting in his federal prison cell. His arrogance had blinded him to a fundamental truth that real power didn't come from fear or money, but from trust. The trust between police and community, between officers and citizens, between those who enforce the law and those they serve. A final email came through as she prepared for bed. Confirmation that the last of Wilson's seized assets had been converted into a victim's compensation fund. Millions of dollars, once stolen through corruption, would now help heal the wounds that corruption had caused. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, other cities, other departments, other Wilsons waiting to be exposed. But tonight, watching the lights of Cedar Grove twinkle under the stars, Agent Chen felt proud of what they'd accomplished. Not just taking down one corrupt cop, but helping an entire community find its way back to justice. The case that had started with one agent being underestimated had ended by teaching everyone a powerful lesson, that positive change was possible, that corruption could be beaten, and that sometimes the biggest victories come from the quietest determination to do what's right, no matter the cost.